LGBTQ plus youth are particularly prone to depression, addiction, and suicide. Many of the decisions that were previously made by parents in consultation with medical and licensed mental health professionals are being shifted to states. How and even whether to provide support and treatment to these young people have become a highly charged political issues with battles in political campaigns and courthouses across the country. To bring clarity to this complicated topic, I'm joined by three experienced experts who come to the subject from three distinct areas of specialization: medical, psychological, and legal. Dr. Megan Mooney is a licensed psychologist in private practice in Houston. She specializes in serving traumatized children and families, particularly queer youth. Shelly Skeen is a senior attorney with Lambda Legal Education and Defense Fund, and that's a national civil rights organization devoted to achieving and protecting civil rights of the LGBTQ plus community. Dr. Michele Hutchison is chief of Pediatric Endocrinology at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. Previously, she was medical director of the Gender Spectrum Transgender Clinic at Arkansas Children's Hospital in Little Rock. It's great to have all of you with us. So, when the Dobbs decision came across, and of course that overturned Roe v. Wade, there was really a lot of concern in the gay community. Why such concern?
I think the concern came from really, in part, Justice Thomas's concurrence. And in his concurrence, what he did was he basically said that substantive due process, which is a theory in the law that's been around since about 1923, that allows us to make certain personal choices about how we raise our kids. So procreation, marriage, whether or not we want to use contraception, how we raise our kids educationally, all of that's a body of law. And in that body of law is what sprung marriage equality, also sprung prohibition against interracial marriage, right? And so
and that was the Loving's decision, right?
Right. That was Loving versus Virginia. That was a 1967 case that said now people of two different races can marry each other. So it's a long-standing precedent that is now called into question because of the Dobbs decision and most particularly Justice Thomas's concurrence.
So what actions have your organization, Lambda Defense Legal Education, done in response to this?
Well, what we're doing is we're trying to educate the public. We are trying to make sure that folks understand that those basic decisions that we make every day and how we order our lives, whether or not we're going to have kids, who we're going to marry, how we raise our children, some of those basic things could be at stake now. So one, letting folks know that that could be one of the outcomes of the opinion. And then also doing policy work in front of legislators to show in what ways laws that don't allow folks to make those kind of decisions every day would violate equal protection or due process, which is part of the 14th Amendment. Mm-hmm. And so that's a couple of things we're doing. And then we also do what I call impact litigation. So where we see violations of civil rights, we will come in, whether it's a law that's been passed, legislation, or the way a law is being implemented. If it's not being implemented in a way that's fair and equitable, then we will file a lawsuit.
So late last year, Congress passed the Respect for Marriage Act. That was really, in a sense, in response to the Dobbs decision, wasn't it?
It was.
I mean, it happened very quickly.
It's happened since about November the 14th. So we got November the 14th. It went.
If everything could go that quickly.
Right. Exactly. So what it does is it, in essence, gets rid of DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, which was passed in 1996. So it says that that's no longer a valid law. And then what it also does is it provides a backstop. So if the Obergefell, the marriage equality decision, is done away with by the Supreme Court, then what would happen is the Respect for Marriage Act is there, and what it says is that if you are validly married in any state or in some foreign country, then whatever state you move into has to recognize your marriage. So it, in essence, would give the ability of whether or not to have a marriage in a particular state back to the states. So some states, like when the Obergefell decision passed, there were 13 states that still did not allow same-sex marriage, Texas being one of them. And so what it would do is, if the Obergefell decision is overturned, and that then the opportunity to determine.
So in a sense, you're being very proactive.
Right.
What didn't it do?
I think the main thing it didn't do was it did not codify Obergefell. So it didn't require states to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples. That's what it did not do.
Question I often ask when we're talking about foreign policy is, what keeps you up at night? When you're looking at the issues that are facing the queer community, what keeps you up at night?
I think what keeps me up is the marginalization. It's laws that are put in place, right? So it's part of my community. Laws perpetuate keeping people otherized, keeping people marginalized. There's systems in place, and especially if you include people who are BIPOC, people who are Black, brown, indigenous people, people of color, right? We see you can change a law like Obergefell. You can change a law like Loving versus Virginia. You can change a law like the Civil Rights Act, right? But it doesn't mean that hearts and minds change, and people tend to not have access to the opportunities that we all should have access to even if you change a law, right? So I think what we saw in the 14th Amendment was trying to give the full breadth and expression of what the Constitution was meant to do, which was to provide equity and opportunity for all that live in this country. And what I think that you're seeing right now is an attempt to restrict what was allegedly granted to us in the Constitution by restricting the 14th Amendment. Equal protection and due process. Equal protection meaning treating similarly situated people the same, and due process. So not being deprived of life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness. Now that's in the Declaration, right? But without due process of law. We all should have those equal opportunities, and that's not what's happening in this country. People like me, people who are not Black and brown, don't have a seat at the table, aren't helping make the laws, can't get elected, right? Then you don't have those voices. And what we also know is that we see this in companies, right? For companies that have a diverse workplace, we see larger profits because you have different perspectives and viewpoints coming together to solve common issues, and what you see is a better overall outcome. One other quick thing I think that's really important to see is what we've seen since we've had marriage equality is in the states across the board. So since 2015, $3.8 billion have come into states' economies as a result of allowing same-sex couples to get married, and then $244.1 million in state and local sales tax revenue. So when you start looking at...
You would think that would resonate.
Right. Exactly. So when you let more people play, then everybody ends up being better off.
Now that we have a good understanding of the legal issues, let's explore the associated medical and psychological implications. Megan, what are the psychological and social impacts of these efforts to change some of the laws on your patients?
Thanks for that question. What we know, research is becoming pretty clear that when there are legislative and policy initiatives that are targeting LGBTQ plus people, especially young people and their families, that there are negative psychological impacts, including increased anxiety, increased depression, and sometimes increased risk of suicidality, especially when young people feel like they're a burden to their family or like they don't belong in their community. Some of the biggest factors we know put people at risk for suicide.
What's the typical age when you first see a young person who is considering or facing these questions?
So in my practice, the youngest person I've seen who is identifying as possibly transgender is about 5. And then my practice goes up through young adults. So what we know from research is that children as young as 3 and 4 can start expressing to us that what the body that they have doesn't match who they are on the inside. And that's pretty clear from research over the years too, that match on with ideas about gender and the construct of gender, especially in our American society.
I was so grateful to have the chance to do this program because it gave me and now our audience an opportunity to learn so much more. Just take a minute and explain some of these definitions, such as what is gender identity and how is that different than sex designated at birth, for instance?
Sure. Well, we could have an entire program devoted just to defining things, but to keep it brief, generally speaking, your gender identity is your sense of self. And this is often driven by social constructs around gender, right? So how other people tell you what it means to be a boy or a girl, for example, versus sex assigned at birth, which is something that's usually a medical designation provided by a physician, usually based on external and internal genitalia and sometimes on chromosomes as well.
So, Michele, you've had an interesting career. You were in Dallas for a period of time and then went to Arkansas, and now you're in New Mexico.
And I had this wonderful opportunity to move to Arkansas and help build a really robust gender program there at that institution.
Well, that's what I really wanted to get to. So you went to Arkansas, but it didn't really turn out the way you had hoped.
Well, it did for quite some time. We had a very robust, very, very successful program. In about the span of about 4.5 years, we helped over 350 families. So I consider that to be a major success. And we very much enjoyed doing it.
But
as the wave of anti-transgender legislation swept the nation, we had the distinct honor in Arkansas of being the first state to actually pass anti-transgender legislation. And that did very much affect our patients very, very negatively.
So when you say that, what happened? Was your clinic closed?
Well, first off, I can tell you that when the legislation was first proposed, before it was even voted, these kids are very attuned to what's happening in the community and what's happening politically. They are very smart. They're very savvy. And our phone literally exploded with concerns, not just from patients, but from families as well, from parents. And that was before the law was even voted. Okay, so we saw anxiety scores and depression scores spike tremendously. We saw increased suicide rates. We saw increased thoughts of suicide and increased hospitalizations for suicide attempts, unfortunately. And it was 2 bumps, if you will. The first time we saw this spike was when the legislation was first proposed. And then again, when the legislator actually voted on it to pass it, we saw a second bump in increase in anxiety and suicidal thoughts.
You both of you, I'm sure, have met with legislators. How familiar are they? How fluent are they in some of the issues? Megan?
Yeah, I would say that they're not very, unfortunately, right? I mean, our legislators are very, very busy people and they're talking to lots of constituents, lots of professionals every day, right? So they're hearing about so many different topics that it's hard for them to retain the nuanced things about, say, gender affirming care, right? And so that's why it's important for professionals and our associations that we're tied to talk with them repeatedly so that they know how important that affirming care is for LGBTQ plus youth, because they're not mental health and medical professionals, so they don't have this daily contact with children and families like Michele and I do.
Michele, I have a feeling you might want to say more on that.
Well, I in the defense of these legislators, they represent the average American populace. And unfortunately, the average American doesn't know a lot about the day-to-day experience of our trans youth. And that's on us to help educate as much as we can. I can tell you that the youth themselves get tired of having to be the educator. You will hear that from patients that they feel like people need to do that homework themselves. But as a provider and somebody who cares for these patients, I try to take it upon myself to educate people as much as I can.
Now, are we seeing this type of legislation in many other states?
Yes, and in fact, if you read the actual wording of these proposed laws, they all read almost identically. They're publicly available. You can go and read them, and I've done so. And they really are carbon copy, cookie cutter proposals.
And does insurance cover the care that is needed for these young people?
Some do, some don't. It's variable.
What do you see in your practice, Megan? Does insurance cover it?
Well, for psychological practice, yes. There's not really a concern in terms of supporting young people with regards to depression, anxiety, et cetera. So I will say that there are some legislative efforts, though, to curtail that and to remove protections for our mental health care by, say, restricting liability insurance coverage, or even outright banning psychological care that would be defined as gender affirming. There are already bills pre-filed here in Texas along those lines.
You know, there's so many misconceptions about treatment, and I know that there are recommendations of how to improve the pediatric transgender care. Michele, what are some of the key points that people need to consider and when you're advising and treating your own patients?
That's a great question, and I wish we could broadcast this far and wide.
We are.
These are, well, good. It's part of the effort. So these are recommendations that are supported by major medical institutions and groups. So, for example, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Endocrine Society, both support these basic protocols. And so from the very basics, you want to provide a supportive and affirming environment for the child. If nothing else, use their preferred pronouns and preferred name. There's a study out of Dallas, in fact, that showed that just using their preferred pronouns and names can decrease their risk of suicidality and their depression scores. And I think that says a lot. And I've certainly seen that with my own eyes. In terms of medical care, we do support the use of, for example, puberty blockers in pubertal children who are not yet ready to start hormone therapy, but you want to slow down the process of their body changing, because when they see their body changing, that triggers the anxiety and the depression. So what we're trying to do is just pushing a pause button so we can give these kids and these families a chance to work through this. It's a journey. It can't be done in one day. Again, it's a very family-centered approach. I have always approached this as this is the child with the parents and the guardian. It really does involve the whole family. So the puberty blockers can be used in the younger children. Another point I'd like to get across is that these are fully reversible therapies. If the child changes their mind, the therapy can be stopped, puberty goes right back to where it was, and no harm, no foul. If the child then is older and decides that and with the consent of the parents, decide that they do want to start what we call cross-sex hormone therapy, then we can use that. Again, that needs to be done with, the involvement of the parents, the psychologist, the provider, and the patient. This is really, they say it takes a village. In this case, it really does. It takes a village. Nobody is doing this in a vacuum, and the parents are always involved. I think one of the big trigger points for people who don't know a lot about this topic is surgery. And we are not doing surgery on minors. It's very, very rare for anybody to propose doing any sort of permanent genital surgery on somebody under 18.
Are doctors permitted to do it, or is it clearly something that is viewed as being unethical?
I think unethical may not be the right word. I think problematic, controversial might be words that are more appropriate. Currently, it is permitted in many states, but there's a recognition, I think, among most of us that one needs to be of the age of consent to make that sort of major medical decision.
Megan, I can imagine a parent wrestling with learning that their child may be transgender. What what should a parent do? And just like Michele said, you work with the whole family. What are the first steps that one might do when Sally says, "I feel like I'm a boy"?
I think the most important thing that parents can do right off the bat is say, I love you no matter what, and we're going to figure this out together. Right. And if that's our baseline, and I really do believe even parents who are struggling quite a bit, like at their heart, they love and care for their children and they want to keep them safe and healthy. Right. And
Right.
so if that's our baseline assumption, then we can figure all the rest of it out from there. Right. So making sure that your child is safe and healthy is the first thing. And then figuring out what are your resources? Who do you need to talk to in your community? Or, with the wonders of telehealth, we can operate, outside of kind of isolated city settings and things like that, and to talk to providers who are experts in the field across our state and get good, reliable, evidence-based information about what kind of concerns you might have. So it depends a lot on the age of the child, and a lot of other things too that might be going on for them. So you probably need to be working with a professional to get a good, comprehensive evaluation and see whether there's anything else needed at that time, or whether the child is okay, just as long as they're in the safe, stable, loving home environment and good school and good friends and that kind of thing.
If someone is economically disadvantaged, what's the first call they should make? Is there a help number like there is for Suicide Watch and so forth?
I guess it depends on what the family's needs are, right? So for many families, even with the economic challenges, there are providers and clinics that take insurance, that take lots of different forms of payment. And so those of us who work in the field know how to reach out to those folks and get help as needed. I think talking to your trusted pediatrician, talking to, a mental health provider. Most of us will at least do like a phone consultation for free, even if it's not something that we can do on an ongoing basis. And many of us do offer, very, very reduced fees for families in need, especially for LGBTQ plus youth, because it can be hard to find an affirming provider.
That's great to hear. What about, and you see this every so often in the media, and it's always negative, but conversion therapy? Why is that so bad?
Well, every major mental health association has said conversion therapy is not just not recommended, but really is advised against. So my own American Psychological Association has put out a number of resolutions.
And let me jump in and just ask you, I should have asked you this first. What is conversion therapy?
Oh, right. Thank you. Right. So the idea being that through some sort of counseling that we could tell somebody and convince them that they're really not gay or lesbian or transgender, that they, have somehow made a mistake. Right. And so, again, the American Psychological Association has issued a number of resolutions that say we as psychologists are not to be engaging in those kinds of, conversion therapy, reparative therapy, change efforts regarding sexual orientation or gender identity, because the evidence is growing and mounting, again, that it's not just not helpful, but that it's actually harmful. And so I think we really need to pay attention to what science says about this. In Texas, it is still legal to engage in, conversion and reparative therapies, but it is against the ethical standards of most of our mental health associations.
So we have just another minute left, and I'd like to ask both of you to tell our viewers, where can they get more information? Where's the best place for reliable information? Michele?
Well, the American Academy of Pediatrics website is going to have information. And then, of course, WPATH.org, WPATH.org is really a international organization that helps support transgender care at all ages. And there's a lot of fantastic information there. Also, the HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, will have a lot of information as well. And if I could just slip in one little point that I think is subtle but makes a difference. You mentioned earlier that, what if Sally comes up and says, I feel like a boy? That's not what these children say. What they say is, I am a boy. And that's a subtle but very, very important distinction.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. Megan, anything that you'd like to add?
Yes, I think some really good resources. I mean, here in Texas, we have the Texas Psychological Association, as well as our other colleagues across the other mental health associations here in Texas, certainly national, the American Psychological Association. For families that really want to know how to best support their young people, I would highly recommend the Family Acceptance Project run by Dr. Caitlin Ryan. Done tremendous research and have just fantastic resources for families who want to find ways to support their young people, even when they're struggling with it, especially based on, perhaps religion or faith-based concerns. There are resources even for those families to find the path to support their young people. And family acceptance is the way that we know to kind of mitigate those risk factors for depression, anxiety, suicidality that we mentioned at the top of the conversation. So again, families should be communicating to their young people, we love and support you, and we're going to figure this out together, along with some trusted providers.
That's great advice. And I think what we all need to remember is to empathize, be tolerant, and learn more. And I hope that's what we did today on our program. Thanks to both of you for being with us. And thank all of you. I found this a fascinating topic, one that I knew practically nothing about. And I want to encourage all of you to reach out to the resources that our guest mentioned and recommended. And as always, we're here talking about things that matter with people who care.